Yay, and hi everybody, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Emma Desi. I'm so thrilled to have you here, and I've got yet another amazing interview for you with somebody I've been following on and off for a very long time, and was absolutely delighted when she said she would come on the show and talk to us about author archetypes. Not the archetypes that authors use to create their characters in their stories, but actually what type of author are you, and what drives you and motivates you, and sort of makes you behave towards your writing in the way that you do. So I'm absolutely thrilled to talk to Becca Syme. Welcome, Becca.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Becca Syme has an MA in Transformational Leadership and is a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach, and has been coaching success alignment for more than a decade. She is the author of the Quitbooks for Writers series and the popular Write Faster, Better course. She also writes mystery novels in her spare time and lives on one of the 1,000 lakes in Minnesota. Wow, I'm amazed you've got any spare time, to be honest, Becca. You are a busy, busy lady.
Yeah, me too. There's not a lot of it. The people who read my mystery books are getting about one a year at this rate.
Hey, that's pretty. I think that's regular. That is more than a lot of people do. But with that in mind, I would love to take you kind of right back to the beginning, and I would love to know, I know you from the work that you do for writers, but I'd love to know about your own journey to writing and how you kind of got involved in this madcap industry.
Yeah, I definitely always wanted to be a writer. Like, I was one of those kids, which I think, statistically speaking, less than half of writers are like this. I know, but I always feel like a lot of us are like this because it's true. But I was one of those kids who was writing stories as soon as I could write. And I was, telling stories before I could write and consuming stories constantly. And I don't think I really thought about doing it professionally in terms of, I wasn't like aiming at novel writing. I just knew that I wanted to write stories all the time, as often as I could. And I loved having other people read them. So I knew I wanted to be published, but I don't think I thought about being a professor. That's a really interesting thought. By the time I got into college, because I was an English major, I had a professor who kind of talked to me about what are the options of being in English. And I was like, well, I really want to write. And he's like, you can write, you could be a writer. It's possible to do that. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so I was going to do an MFA after I was done with my undergrad in English. And so I started thinking about writing novels really when I was about 19. And I wrote my first novel at 21, and it was a romance novel because I was in love with Julie Garwood. I was so sad to learn that she recently passed away. And I immediately went back and reread a couple of her books that I had loved because that was what got me into writing novels. The first time that I actually completed a novel, it was a historical romance novel. And so, but I was always wanting to tell stories on some level. So I knew that writing would be in my future. There was no question about it. And then when I did the MFA, it turned out to be kind of a track to teach and not really a track to write. Okay. And so I actually dropped out of my MFA program before I finished because I didn't want to teach creative writing. I was teaching as part of my MFA. I got a scholarship and I was teaching, and I didn't like teaching writing to students because I didn't want to read other people's writing. I wanted to write my own stuff. And so I went back to the same professor actually. And he was like, well, if you become a professor of something else of English literature, then you could have a lot of time to potentially write books and your faculty would want you to do that. And it's weird because I went back to this town that I had lived in before where I went to undergrad, assuming that I would get my master's and PhD in English lit and become an English professor. And then I was asked to head up a nonprofit in my local town. And I took that job sort of thinking well, I can do it all, right? Because that's just my brain. And I ended up getting a little bit obsessed with the idea of this nonprofit and of providing a place for kids and connection and helping them to build relationships and create safety in their teenage years. And then that was actually what led me to the Strengths Finder, because I took that as part of my master's degree. And then my life just veered away. Like, I didn't go back to literature. I didn't get my PhD in lit. And I instead got a master's degree in transformational leadership, and then started going off into organizational studies and understanding alignment and personality. And I really got obsessed with the Clifton Strengths. And that was what took me off in that direction. Like, I started to really understand how wired my brain was to be able to help people align themselves in motivations. And I didn't know that before the strengths, and it got in my brain. And of course, being a writer who primarily writes stories about characters, I don't know why I was surprised that people were my fascination. But that kind of became my trajectory from there. I got really into that, and I just kept doing that in every organization that I was a part of, and was helping organizations align themselves and do things like that. And then I got back into professional writing again through RWA USA, the USA version. And then I got published, and then I went in indie in 2012, went indie, and then I became full-time. And then I kind of look back and never, ne'er the twain shall meet again, Becca, with a full-time job. But that was great.
Yeah. What an interesting trajectory that you've had, and how
That's so weird.
Sort of started with fiction and then has kind of done this loop and come back to still writing your own fiction. I know you coach authors as well. Touch on that a bit later. But then it's wonderful when, and this is a lovely thing about being a creative person, I think, and being in this field, you can take two things that you love and combine them and do them both and have the best of both worlds, which is so lovely. So that's interesting then. So you've been writing fiction and things, but then, so what made you make that jump from doing the Strengths Finder, writing your own fiction, into starting the Quit series and the Write Better Faster course and community?
Yeah, it was really, my friends were struggling a lot with how to align themselves to what they needed to do to get their, especially to be entrepreneurs. Like, there was a lot of the degree that I had was sort of organizational and industrial leadership, and a lot of especially the focus was on individual alignment, but then also on organizational alignment. So I had a lot of background in organizational leadership and trying to help organizations be better and be more aligned. So I had a lot of knowledge about kind of business alignment, if that makes sense. So my friends would ask me questions about, like, oh my gosh, I have to work with this editor. And I'm like, well, if you know this about conflict management, then you can do this, this, and this. And if you happen to know what their strengths are, then that would help me be able to get, and I just kind of started giving advice to people because I was so obsessed with strengths and with personality and just in general with alignment and especially organizational alignment. So I got asked to teach a class at the Margie Lawson Academy about this, specifically about how to align your indie author business. And then that became the kind of first iteration of the Write Better Faster class, which then eventually just morphed into, coaching all the time, because there really, especially at that time when I got into indie publishing, there really wasn't a lot of how to do this business effectively advice. And almost all of what you would hear from like MLMs and entrepreneurial, kind of stuff, it's like, that's not really going to function well for us because we're so creative and we need to use our brains. And so much of what I know about strengths is about how different brains function differently and how people have to align and orient themselves to their brain function in order to be able to get the most out of themselves as an entrepreneur. And so I was like, okay, I guess this is what we're going to do now, is just, we're going to try to help people. And so we used, especially when I was first doing like Indie Insider and Write Better Faster, we used everything I could get my hands on. Like literally, I was joking with somebody about like, I would like to know what bagel you think you are, because just having the conversation about like, which bagel are you, it helps me to orient you on a continuum of behavior so that I can be like, oh, okay, so you think that you're very predictable and this, and does that lend itself to the type of things that you're trying to do in your author career? And what I would typically see is people who were unpredictable and unorganized, who wanted badly to be predictable and organized, but they could not force themselves to do it because in order to have that level of structure, they needed an external person to make pressure on them. And we all know with Indie, we are basically on our own in this business, right? Until we build structures of support around us. And so a lot of what I was doing was trying to help people compensate for being externally motivated instead of trying to teach them how to be internally motivated, which is what the productivity industrial complex tries to do, right? It's like, well, let's make you all be more motivated from the inside instead of acknowledging why some of us are not internally motivated and working with those systems instead. So that's kind of where that came about, was like, individual alignment is really what I'm passionate about. Taking seriously who you are as a person and believing yourself when your behavior tells you you need to act in this way. Okay, it's like, if we accept that you're going to act that way, how do we orient your business so that it takes the most advantage of that and you don't expect things of yourself that you can't give?
Yeah, I think that's what in my study, which is not as in-depth as yours, but around archetypes, I think that has been one of the biggest learnings I've had. I can't force myself to be a different type of person.
Yes.
I have to take what I've got and work with what I've got, and some of it will be great and some of it
Yes.
won't be so great, and that's okay.
Yes. Yes. And it should be that way. Like from a strengths perspective, positive psychology or success psychology, which is what I specifically am in now. When it comes to where we can expect success from people, no one is capable of being good at everything. No one is even capable of being average at everything. We have varying grades of our ability to be good at different things. So the more time we spend trying to be good at things we are not good at, and we go at best from really crappy to kind of below average, it's like, why would I ever want to spend time making myself be below average at something instead of just putting that off my plate, having someone else do it, or just not doing it at all, and instead focusing on where I'm going to have an easier, faster time and where I'm going to make a bigger impact, really, because that's what success psychology is really about, is what is the most likely thing that you could do where you could have success doing it. Rather than assuming that there's one way to be and everyone needs to be this way, we assume there is no one way to be. There is no standard. Everyone's internal personal standard is different. We just need to know what that standard is and then orient you around that standard.
And it's wonderful that you've been doing that around the sort of authorpreneur side of things, because everywhere you look, there's people happy to teach you how to write. That is not something we lack resources for, but definitely I think that business side of it and taking the fear out of that is really useful. But I love though that you've taken that. I can see your trajectory here. You know, you've worked on the strengths, you've worked in corporate, then you've moved that into the indie space, still with a kind of business head on. So it does feel like a natural swing, a natural move then, that actually you'd start to look at the authors themselves and the strengths and the weaknesses and the different personality types that we as individuals bring to our writing life and our creative life. So I wonder if you would give us a sort of overview then of the archetypes that you've come across, that you've identified. And I know too that you talk about continuums as well. So I wonder if you'd share a bit about that with us.
Yeah, I think my experience with very, very broad picture personality types, right? Like, and I always use the DISC or the Myers-Briggs as an example, where it's like, okay, there are 16 types or 4 types or whatever, like those pieces have such a continuum of application throughout the typing that it's, and I don't mean continuum in the way that I'm going to use it in a second. Bell curve is probably the better way to describe it, right? Where it's like, if I test as high stability in the disc, I am not necessarily the same as other people who test in high stability. The only thing that's similar about us is this desire that we all need stability. And what I felt like people were doing with Myers-Briggs was the biggest one that I saw this happen with, especially early in my career when I was doing alignment, where people would be like, well, you're an ENFP and I'm an ENFP, so we clearly are motivated in the same way. And I'm like, you're not, though. The two of you could not be more different. There is this one piece of you, this ENFP piece, that is similar. But there's so much about you that's different, and all of those differences really matter in terms of how you're going to organize your life. So when you have a particular personality test, like, and I would exclude the strengths and the Enneagram from this for other reasons, which I can talk about more later, but the majority of the way that these other tests are created is that somebody looked out and said, hey, there's 4 types of people, or there's 8 types or 16 types of people. And then they organized that system on their own based on what their observations were, right? It's more rare to have the other, to go from the other direction. But what happens is when you have a personality test like that, it really is only organized around one principle. It can't tell you a lot about other things. Like, how am I going to act in other situations that are not tested by this test? It can't tell you that. How am I going to be successful? It can't tell you that. How am I motivated? It can't tell you that, right? But we try to use those things. And so what I was trying to do is isolate those variables as much as possible for myself. So when I'm looking at why writers make decisions differently, and we're already familiar with one of the biggest discussions about archetypes in writing, because we naturally talk about it constantly, which is plotters versus pantsers. Mm-hmm. So we instinctively know that there is a way to isolate a personality variable and then place ourselves on a continuum between one extreme and the other, and that all of us fall somewhere in between that one extreme and the other extreme. It isn't just 2 categories of writers. It literally is a continuum where there's a general organizational principle on one side and then the opposite on the other side. Mm-hmm. The difference is when we get outside of plotters versus pantsers, we often forget that that continuum of difference exists, and we start looking for predictive, tactical, strategic, like predictions. And it just can't happen, because every single behavior that we have, every way that we organize decisions internally comes from some kind of a motivation. Mm-hmm. And depending on what it is that is motivating that desire or that change or that action, you can isolate the personality variables into, like, basically into continuums for everything. So when I was coaching writers and I was using something like the Strengths Finder, and I realized I might have 5 different achievers who are all in this, achievers, one of this Clifton strengths. I might have 5 different achievers who are all in various places in their trajectory, their career trajectory, who all struggle with very different things because they don't understand their orientation towards writing to market, right? So they're all achievers. They're all technically going to be the most excellent when they do achiever things, right? Hard work, making lists, whatever it is. But that doesn't apply to how they write to market, because that's not what that particular test was meant to check for. It doesn't check for that level of, nuance. And so I would look at all of the different people that I was coaching, because I've coached more than 6,000 individual authors, and I've had 6,000 people in my classes, not I've talked to 6,000 people at conferences. I mean, individual one-on-one, sitting across from them, talking and interviewing. Like, that is what I do. And it is my obsession, right? So it makes sense that sometimes I coach 10 hours a day. So like that to me is just, it's my obsession. So anyway, the reason that's important is because of the volume of data that I can see when I do something like that. So when I see like I'm coaching all of these different achievers, we're all asking questions about writing to market, but we're getting different answers. And it's like, why are we getting different answers? So I would immediately go to their other strengths, can't explain the difference patterns, the similar and different patterns in the strengths. So I would go to the Enneagram, can't explain the differences from it. So I would go to the DISC, can't do it. Myers-Briggs, can't do it. And I kept going to a different test, looking at everyone's results, trying to figure out what it was that was the missing variable in this particular situation. And what I kept coming across is there clearly is a very specific personality motivation that has to do with how we orient ourselves toward the market. And so then I would look at like, well, what is the question that we're asking ourselves and how do we answer it and all that stuff? So what happened was I started making notes and organizing my thoughts and running it by my coaches, because I have coaches who work for me. And it was sort of oh no, there is really a pattern here. There's clearly a difference. So then let's start talking about that difference, and then let's create a continuum for it. And then, because we're always tracking behavior, right? And so then I would do like a workshop on it, which would be the culmination of like 6 years worth of, work. And so I would do the workshop talking about the right to market continuum, and then we would sort of release it, and then other people would talk about it. I would get more feedback. We would refine it, stuff like that. So that's kind of been the process, but it's been a very long, intensive, very research heavy process.
Well, I've certainly sort of gleaned that from you, that you are someone who likes to do things thoroughly and,
oh my gosh, yes.
go for it. So I think what I'm understanding you say is that when you were looking for motivation for writers particularly, and I'll come back in a minute to the kind of right to market variable you were mentioning there, is that you were looking for explanations in all the existing measurements, but nothing seemed to fit, nothing seemed to kind of make sense for writers. And so then it was almost like, it feels like you had to kind of start from scratch and make these brand new observations from the people you interviewed. And then you've made you've noticed certain behaviors and motivations is a word I've written down, that seems to be something that's important. What is motivating us to right to market is something you've mentioned. So is that what you're trying to establish predominantly with the archetypes that you're developing, is why do some people right to market and some people don't? Or why do some have success?
Why are some people able to do the process of right to market, and why do some people struggle with it? And then why do some people not care about it? And why do some people actively work against it, right? Because those are kind of the 4 different spots that I found on the continuum. Was you would have the like hardcore, I cannot do anything, but like I need to be as successful as possible at writing to market and make as much money as I possibly can, and be really obsessed with doing that thing that everyone is doing, right?
And so but when you talk about writing to market, what do you kind of what's your definition of that?
So the process of looking at the market itself, what it is that is selling, and writing a book that is specifically made to be targeted at the market. Because what happens is, so like the people who are obsessed with like, I need to do this because the market is telling me what to do, and I'm going to listen to what the market says. And I want to be on that cutting edge, and I want to be the person who's, like killing it, right? That there's a big difference between that motivation when you sit down to write versus the motivation of, I can be interested in the market. I can maybe even be fascinated by the idea of writing to market. But when I sit down to write, if I don't write what is inside me to write, then I'm going to suck at it. And even when I try to write to market, I'm probably going to miss the mark of writing to market. And I would be better off thinking about things like tropes that I like, or The storylines or the characters that I really like to write. And I would be better off looking at my organic self as a writer rather than looking at the market whatsoever, because I'm not going to be able to make the decisions inside the manuscript that you're going to have to make in order to quote unquote hit the target of the market, because I'll be better off actually hitting the market target if I write organically what is in me to write.
Uh-huh.
And the hard part about that is that people who are that more organic style, which is what we call the evergreen, right? That the archetype of the evergreen. There are a lot of people who are evergreens who really like watching the market. They like watching those people who are writing to market because they have a motivation for making money or for selling a lot of books or for something else, but it doesn't make a difference when they get into the story. Because when they're actually in the book, they struggle to be able to access the things. So they can't, for instance, like in the typical write to market experiment, you would read things that are what we would call center of genre, or read things that are very successful that are center of genre. And you would go looking for the patterns between what all those books have in common. What emotional need are they meeting of the readers, or whatever it is that that you're looking for when you're doing the research. And people who are drafters, which is that right, more of the like classic right to market archetype, people who are drafters are able to look at the data inside the books and create something that looks like that thing, whatever it is that's popular, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the people who are evergreens, they might be fascinated by what sells. They might be fascinated by what the drafters are doing, but they can't sit down in the manuscript and reproduce something that doesn't feel like a empty copy of what someone else has done. They're going to write their best work, and they're going to write more to market by being the evergreen, right? And this is the key, is this, it isn't just do authors do this, it's how do authors have success in their writing. They're specifically author success archetypes, right? So it's not just I can write to market and fail at it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not looking at that as an indicator of the success archetype, right? I'm looking at people who have successfully done a good job of writing to market. How have they done that? Evergreens cannot afford to look too much at the market itself, because they're going to read the wrong indicators of what should make the book sell. Yeah. And they're so much better off writing organics, or things that are organic to them. And then the other two archetypes are don't care about it, like just not gonna, who cares what everybody else is doing. And then that's the islands. And then the trailblazers are people who actively want to write things that no one else is writing. They're always looking to blaze new ground. And generally speaking, they care a lot about whether they have been first at it. Like they would prefer to be early or first, and it bothers them a lot when they're not.
So
Yeah.
I love it. I don't know if you feel comfortable doing this, but successful authors that who you feel fit into each of these 4 archetypes. Are you happy to kind of name people, or is that?
So I usually don't, just because I prefer it when people kind of name themselves. And what happens in author groups, just because with the data, I don't have anybody's permission to say like, hey, can I use your name in this thing? And I feel like that crosses a line for me of like, all of this data was gathered in this way. But what happens, because like when I went to 20 books or when I went to RAM and talked about this, you would hear people start to say like, yes, this is me. This is me. Because for instance, what I can't do is I can't look at someone I haven't coached and say, oh, they're clearly this thing, because so much of it is about your internal motivation. And I have to be able to hear, this is one of the reasons that the quizzes have not been developed yet, is because I have to be able to hear what the motivational behavior statements are that we're saying, and we need to collect that data still, because what we're still collecting is the outcomes, right? It's like, if I watch someone, like for instance, but there's one I know I can say, well, actually there's two I know I can say because they've said in public before that they are these things. So like Pippa Grant is a evergreen. And when she talks about writing to market as an evergreen, she talks about tropes and the trope architecture. And she talks about her own readers and the stories that she loves. Like that's a very evergreen kind of way to be, versus like Yasmin Galenorn, who is an urban fantasy writer, very successful, is a trailblazer. And we talk a lot about, with her, she's talked about what it's like to sort of be a trailblazer and to want to be on the cutting edge of something, right? And that feeling of, and she would not use the word cutting edge. It's I need to do what is unusual or unpredictable, or what's, intuitively she gets led in that direction. And so those are the only two that I know for sure that I am comfortable enough saying. But when other people talk about it in author groups, you'll hear people chime in all the time and they'll be like, well, yes, I'm clearly a drafter and I'm clearly an island. I do think we talked about Terry Schott because he's a sci-fi writer. And I'm pretty sure he would be okay with me saying that he's an island. And then drafters, honestly, the majority of people who are successful at writing to market intentionally are drafters. We don't need examples of drafters. We have them all over the place, right? So like there are tons of people who are visible, who are successful drafters. But like Terry as an island, for instance, he doesn't listen to what anyone says about the stories he's going to choose to write. And the way that he takes feedback as an island is always running it through the filter of, is this something I would agree with, right? Or is this something, and he's very, very like, I would rather go down by my own hand on, than he would want to take anyone else's advice. And so that level of sort of island behavior is really normal, of the like, I'm just not even gonna think about what other people think that I should write. Like, why would I think about that?
Mm-hmm. And have you noticed if there is a kind of skew, or do most people fit into one or other of these archetypes? Have you noticed yet?
There's a high percentage of them who are evergreens, and almost a majority of writers are evergreens, to a point where we're actually considering splitting the evergreens into two, because there is so much difference between the evergreens that are closer to the islands and the evergreens that are closer to the drafters, where they almost have some qualities that mimic the drafters a little bit, but they just can't, when they sit down to do the writing, they can't think too much about the other people and their competitors and the market and what's trendy and all that stuff. Whereas like drafters generally get pretty obsessed with that and are very, they draw themselves into those conversations.
Yeah, I
think
the
majority of people are evergreens.
Yeah, though that makes sense. I certainly, from what you've described today, I think I would definitely be that. I am always watching those drafters. They're always the ones on the top table at conferences, and I wish that I could just do this and I could write 200 books and it would all be brilliant. But yes, even when I have attempted to plan a book by chapter 2, I've taken a completely different turn and the story is something else entirely.
Yep. That's so always the way you're an evergreen, right? Is when you're interested enough in the drafters that you're not doing I just don't care about them, right? But you're interested enough in them. And this is why we want to split those. And I think we eventually will split those but I need a big enough sample of just evergreens that I can kind of divide them apart and see where the actual lines are, because it's such a huge number of writers that are evergreen. But when they sit down to write, they really do the best when they either focus on the trope or the expectation of the reader that they know they're writing for, or when they literally and that's sort of that one side that's closer to the drafters, which are the people who can look at tropes and write to trope. And then you kind of have the evergreens on the other side, who are just completely organic, 100%. need to not really think about expectations that anyone has for anything and just kind of write what they want and write for themselves. And so there is a little delineation there. I just don't know what we're going to call them yet. Plus, I really like the evergreen metaphor, just in terms of it is very organic and it grows very easily and quickly, and it does not give a lot, right? Like the desire of a lot of evergreens is that they would rather be drafters because they feel like that's where all of the money is. But there's just as much money in being an evergreen. It's just you're not going to do it the way the drafters do it. So you don't have to do all the work that the drafters do. You have to do different work. But it's really painful and difficult for evergreens who have come up in the industry watching some of the drafters have the success they've had, and then watching some of the evergreens that have had success not really come out and say like, hey, there's a different way to do this though, because they couldn't teach someone how to be an evergreen. Like you can't teach someone how to be a more organic writer, but you can absolutely teach someone how to structure a book for a market. Whether they can do it or not is different, but you can teach someone how to do that. So that becomes class material. And then the evergreens generally are not class teachers. I mean, not that they might teach other classes, but they're not teaching people how to write to market.
It's so fascinating. I'm just seeing all these parallels in my own life. Writing life. It's so funny. You've mentioned that you incorporate archetypes and behavioral motivations and strengths in your coaching. Are you incorporating these new archetypes into the coaching as well? And how does that work for your coachees, your mentees? And did they receive it well?
Yeah, that was actually where it started. Was I started off needing words to give them when we would talk about, so like the most common coaching call that I would have in like 2018, probably 2019, was with evergreens who were trying to write to trend or write to market and were failing at it and weren't sure why they were failing at it. And so I was trying to provide some structure around like, it's normal not to use this very prescriptive system to write to market if you can't do all of the steps that are required to make that system work. Then you need to focus on doing something else. And basically it's possible. This is why I wrote the Dear Writer, Are You Intuitive book, because it's possible for you to write a completely written to market book without intending to write it to market, with just you intending to follow your intuition. And it was very hard for a lot of evergreens to internalize that. And so I started using some of this archetype continuum in coaching just to say like, hey, there are different ways that people write to market. Here are a few of them. And it started off with just primarily the drafters and evergreens, just so I could give them the difference, sort of like plotters and pantsers, right? Like just give them the difference between these two things. You do not have to intend to write to market in order to do it. And so in coaching, it was a lot of people were coming with a specific problem, right? Like I tried to write this series to market and it flopped. Why did it flop? So we would go back through and try to talk through, how did you create it? What was the research you did? When you sat down to write, what happened? And then when we would get to the point where they would describe their write to market process, I was like, oh, so you weren't writing to market. Like you weren't able to make yourself do that, because if you could have made yourself, not meaning that the books would have sold better, because I don't actually believe that they would have sold better, but would I have done a better job of writing to market if I could force myself to write this type of character because that's what this type of trope needs or this type of market wants? I would have at least done a better job of writing the series to what the market wanted, apparently. And so then we would have those conversations, right? About why did I not do this correctly? And that was the helpful part, was sort of understanding that there was a methodology behind why you were not doing it the way that other people were doing it. Questioning the premise of thou shalt write to market kind of, from on high that often comes down to writers. It's like, no, you don't have to do that. And also, you are not going to fail because you don't write to market. That's not a given. There are plenty of people who don't write to market who are successful. It's just, are you good at the process of doing that particular process? Because drafters are really wired for it.
Yeah.
And other people can only do it if they do the actual Chris Fox version, which is that you only go after genres, tropes, and stories that light you up and that you love to read. And then you're basically doing the evergreen version anyway, right? So like, but the drafters who were sort of trying to write what was trendy or write what was selling, then that version is very hard for evergreens to excel at because they generally can't write things that aren't organic to them.
I'm thinking of an author called Alessandra Torre. I don't know if you've come across her, and I don't know if she's ever done your system or not, but when I've heard her talk about her career, it was a bet. You know, she'd said, oh, I could do that better, and her husband said, well, go on then. So she did, and she became this really best-selling romance author, even though that is not the genre in which she wanted to write. And I think she's now moved to thriller, which is her love. So I think she's a great example then of the drafters who just have that capacity to, I don't want to say switch off from it, but
no, because it's really just an analyzing, right? It's more like it's the ability to parse the details of what is actually hitting the reader buttons and then decide, how do I do that differently but the same? And then execute on whatever that decision was, because that's usually where a lot of us fall off the ability to do right to market, is either we can't tell the difference between whether or not this element that's the same between the books is one that the readers care about being the same. Like, just because if you were to look at the Western romance bestsellers at any one time, you're either going to find a high percentage from Texas or a high percentage from Montana. Does that mean that that is the only place that you can write in if 60% of them are set in Montana? No. But if you don't know about the genre and you don't understand the conventions, you might look at that and be like, well, I guess I have to set this in Montana, right? Because that feels like and that's a simplistic, way to describe it. But if you don't have the ability to tell what the readers actually care about, then it's hard to know which of the details you need to keep and which ones you need to change. And so that is where a lot of people struggle with right to market, is actually in the execution.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense to me. And it sounds then, I mean, when you've been talking to your coachees about this, it must be so liberating for them to kind of just understand, oh, I just don't work that way and I don't have to try anymore, and I can move on and do something that fills me in a more meaningful way and makes me happier. And come back to that, which I think a lot of writers can forget, that actually they're writing because they love it, and it's supposed to be, yes, it's challenging, but also gives a lot of joy as well. And I think if we get caught up in trying to make money with it, then we can lose a bit of that joy, which is always a shame. We're coming up towards the top of the hour here with our time together, and I can't believe how quickly it's gone. I haven't even got through all my questions. So what we talked before we started recording, we were mentioning that there's no specific place to kind of guide people to if they're interested in learning more about these author archetypes. But you did mention that your TikTok account is the best place to kind of follow for when updates do come around. So I'm definitely going to be linking to that in the show notes so that people can go in and just find out more and get updates from you as and when they need. I follow your YouTube channel, so I recommend people do that. I'll definitely be linking to that as well. But
there's a couple of YouTube videos on the archetypes currently. And then there was a video from last year's 20 books where we talked about the right to market archetypes. And then I think we have 2 other videos on the YouTube channel. So those 2 places are definitely the best, like the TikTok and then the YouTube.
Okay, so super pleased to go. But I'd love to know a little bit more. I mean, it sounds like this is going to be just consuming you for the next few years until you kind of round it out. And But is there anything that you would kind of like to just tell us about that's coming up for you, either as an author or as a coach, that it'd be nice for us to know about?
Yeah, in September, we're going to run a Kickstarter. We're doing a pre-launch this month in August. We're doing a launch of a sustainability Kickstarter. And the goal is going to be, it's going to be a game, and it's going to be all about how to make this your long-term author career, basically. And so it's going to be kind of the kickoff to a whole bunch of content that we're going to produce over the next couple of years about how to help us have an author career for our entire lifetime, instead of sort of doing the boom and bust of the gold rush and then everyone only getting a 1 to 3 year runway. And then if you don't make it work in that 1 to 3 years, then you run out of money and end up having to, quit, and then feeling like you've somehow failed, instead of recognizing that this is basically just Vegas and we just need to keep putting, slots in over time. And there still is a potential that you could win in the future. And again, not to downplay all of the hard work that goes into making the chances. But I think the goal is to help us do a little bit more gamification of our author career, and to really help us have another tool to succeed. We recently did a Kickstarter on doing a deck of cards for when authors get stuck in their manuscript. So when we run the next Kickstarter, we're going to have those available again as an add-on for this. But the new Kickstarter is really going to be all about attempting to do work on ourselves to be able to do this career for as long as we possibly can. So that's kind of what's coming up for us in the future. And the archetypes is going to be part of that content eventually. So that, because again, for me, when you know what your alignment is, then you have more control over your sustainability in the long run.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. It's funny. I don't know why, but I feel that my success is going to, as an author, is going to come in 20 years time. I don't know why, but I just have this certainty. If I just keep doing my doing and keep going, it'll happen.
Yeah, I love that.
If you're happy to just hold on for just a couple of more minutes, I've heard you talk about the gold rush in one of your podcast episodes, and I was really curious about this because I'm kind of thinking, oh, the gold rush has been and gone, it's finished. But I think you were saying in your episode, no, I think it's kind of still here. Where do you stand on that?
So I do think the gold rush is done in terms of like the actual, the weird part about the gold rush in publishing, though, is if you think about the gold rush in the US, which happened in California, right? The gold was a limited resource and it was not replenished and it was gone. So like once it was finished, it was not coming back, right? Whereas like the gold rush of publishing is more like, it's a little bit more of a renewable resource. So really the gold rush being over didn't really happen until the saturation point of the market was so significant that you couldn't compensate anymore organically. So like it wasn't possible. So during the gold rush, it wasn't a pay to play era, right? The pay to play era is what we call shovel sellers. So if you're thinking about gold rush, right? It's like when the gold is there, and it is not free, but like it's free flowing, right? It's there and more easily able to be accessed. Then once it becomes less easy to access, then the money is often more made, not from the resource itself, but from other resources, right? So when their shovel sellers come along and try and sell, gold-plated shovels to the miners, basically, or whatever it is, right? So once we get into the pay-to-play era where the Facebook, Amazon, not that it's bad for people to charge for their services. I am a fan of like, if you pay for it, you take it seriously. I think that's true. But what happens when we saturate something is that we compensate for saturation by money being more important to success than it used to be. So it was less important for independent published authors in the past, whether you could afford to run ads or not. And today it is imperative. There are some people still, and especially the people who maintained a platform from the gold rush years. But there are people still who don't have to run ads. It's just way, 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 way less normal. To find organic growth happening. And when it does happen, it feels a little bit more like on TikTok, right? Where at the very beginning of TikTok, we had sort of that gold rush of it's free flowing over here, all of the book talk love. And now we're heading more into it's less organic. There's a lot more money being exchanged for things. And anytime that happens, it changes the dynamic of a platform. So for me, the important piece about Gold Rush is that we're still operating with Gold Rush thinking in the industry when we're actually in the transition to the golden age of publishing. So when you're in the transition to the golden age of publishing, that means that there's years where it's unsettling, where the old rules don't really apply. Everybody who's trying to use the old rules still is frustrated that the old rules don't work. And we have to find the new rules. So it's sort of like, what are the new rules of publishing going to be? Well, let's discover them. You know, there are definitely some rules which I think we have overlooked during the gold rush, like speed is not necessarily king for every author. And so there are things that I think we're coming to learn more easily than we did during the gold rush. But we're not yet in the golden age fully, because we kind of haven't assimilated past all of the stuff that's still keeping us locked into gold rush thinking. So I think once we fully get out of that, like any transition of thought, right, like from modernism to postmodernism, for instance, there's decades in between where we are still halfway in modernism and halfway in postmodernism. My hope is that it won't take us that long with publishing to like normalize. But at some point, we're going to be in the golden age of publishing. And I think that to me is part of why sustainability is so important, because the openness of the industry is going to continue forever. There doesn't seem to be an indication that just because the industry changes, that the openness of publishing is going to change. There is no more sort of New York monopoly on access to readers. So that is going to continue indefinitely until, you know, who knows, maybe the world will end. I don't know. But like, it looks like it's going to sort of continue indefinitely. So there's no reason to believe that there's some kind of closed future out there where no one is going to be able to have access. Even when people are worrying about things like AI, it's like, right, but it'll normalize at some point. It's going to be painful. It is going to be painful for a majority of people who are worried or stressed or you know, like about AI. And I acknowledge that. And also there's something beyond that. Like there's something in an openness of publishing that is beyond all of that, that is going to exist. And I think when we don't focus on the fact that there's a bigger picture going on and there is a future beyond this, and we all just need to get to that place beyond the transition, beyond whatever disruptions are going to happen, it's that then we're not being as available to what is possible in the future. And I just want us to be open to it.
Yeah. It just heartens me to hear you talk about the golden age of publishing is yet to come. That fills me with a lot of excitement.
Yeah.
Oh, Becca, I could talk to you for forever. You are a font of knowledge. It's wonderful.
I'm a font of something for sure.
But I must let you go. So I will just say thank you so much for joining me today. I know that everyone is going to really learn something. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.